The morning started like any other Tuesday for David. He woke up at 6:30, grabbed a quick coffee and headed to the delivery depot. David had been working as a delivery driver for almost 3 years now. It wasn't his dream job, but it paid the bills while he studied social work at the community college. He had big plans for his future, but for now he was content driving around town, dropping off packages and meeting different people every day. The depot was buzzing with activity when he arrived. Drivers were loading their trucks, supervisors were checking routes, and the sound of scanning devices filled the air. David picked up his handheld scanner and walked over to his assigned truck. Today's route would take him through the residential areas on the east side of town. These were nice neighborhoods with well-kept houses and manicured lawns. As he loaded the packages into his truck, David noticed one particular delivery that caught his attention. It was a heavy box addressed to someone on Oakwood Drive. The return label showed it was from a security equipment company. David didn't think much of it at the time. People ordered all kinds of things these days. The first few stops of the day went smoothly. An elderly man was waiting for his medication. A young mother received baby formula she had ordered online. A teenager got excited about receiving his new gaming headset. These were the interactions that made David's job enjoyable. He liked meeting people and being part of their daily lives, even if it was just for a few minutes. Around noon, David pulled up to a quiet street called Oakwood Drive. The houses here were bigger than in other parts of his route. They had large front yards and two-car garages. Most of the driveways had nice cars parked in them. It was the kind of neighborhood where people worked professional jobs and sent their kids to good schools. The house he was looking for was painted light blue with white trim. There were flower boxes under the windows, though the flowers looked a bit wilted. The lawn was neatly cut, and there was a small garden gnome sitting beside the front steps. Everything looked normal and peaceful from the outside. David grabbed the heavy package from his truck and walked up the front path. The package was addressed to Michael Chen at 1247 Oakwood Drive. As he approached the door, he could hear the faint sound of a television playing inside. He rang the doorbell and waited. After a few moments, he heard footsteps approaching. The door opened slowly and a woman appeared. She looked to be in her early 30s with shoulder-length black hair. She was wearing a white cardigan over dark pants. What struck David immediately was how nervous she seemed. Her eyes darted quickly from his face to the package and then back again. "Delivery for Michael Chen," David said with his usual friendly smile. The woman nodded quickly. "That's my husband. I can sign for it." As she reached for David's electronic signature pad, he noticed her hands were shaking slightly. At first he thought maybe she was just having a bad day. Everyone has those. But as he looked more closely, something else caught his attention. There were small dark spots on her white cardigan. They weren't big, maybe the size of quarters, but they were definitely there. The spots looked old, like they had been there for a while. David had seen enough in his life to recognize what dried blood looked like, and these spots were making him uncomfortable. The woman signed her name quickly on the electronic pad. Her signature was shaky and hard to read. As she handed the device back to David, he noticed she kept tugging at her sleeves. It was a warm day in late spring, definitely not cold enough to need long sleeves, but she seemed determined to keep her arms covered. "Thank you," she said quietly, barely making eye contact. David smiled and nodded. "No problem. You have a great day, ma'am." But as he turned to leave, something made him glance back. The woman was still standing in the doorway watching him. Her expression looked worried, almost fearful. She wasn't looking at him with fear, but rather like she was afraid of something else entirely. Walking back to his truck, David couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He had been doing this job long enough to develop good instincts about people. Most of the time, customers were happy to receive their packages. They were friendly, chatty, sometimes even offered him a bottle of water on hot days. But this woman seemed different. As he drove to his next delivery, David found himself thinking about what he had seen. Those spots on her cardigan really did look like bloodstains. And why was she so nervous about signing for a package? It wasn't like he was asking for personal information or trying to come inside the house. The more he thought about it, the more concerned he became. David had grown up in a household where things weren't always peaceful. His mother had gone through some difficult times when he was younger. He remembered the way she used to act when she was scared or upset. The nervous energy, the way she would jump at sudden noises, the long sleeves even when it was warm outside. But David also knew he couldn't jump to conclusions. Maybe the woman had just been cooking and spilled something on her shirt. Maybe she was naturally shy around strangers. Maybe she was having a stressful day at work and was distracted. There could be dozens of innocent explanations for what he had observed. Still, as he continued his route that afternoon, the image of the woman in the doorway kept coming back to him. Something about the whole interaction felt off. It wasn't just one thing he could point to, but rather a combination of small details that didn't quite add up. By the time David finished his deliveries and returned to the depot that evening, he had almost convinced himself he was overreacting. He unloaded his truck, turned in his scanner, and headed home. But even as he tried to focus on his evening routine, he couldn't completely shake the memory of that nervous woman and those mysterious stains on her white cardigan. That night, as he sat at his kitchen table working on homework for his social work classes, David found himself thinking about the ethics they had been discussing in class. When do you have a responsibility to speak up if you suspect someone might be in trouble? How do you balance respecting people's privacy with looking out for their safety? These weren't just academic questions anymore. They felt very real and very personal. 3 days later, David found himself back on Oakwood Drive. It wasn't part of his regular route that day, but he had a delivery for a house just 2 blocks away. As he drove past the light blue house, he slowed down slightly and glanced toward the front door. He told himself he was just being curious, but deep down he knew he was hoping to see some sign that everything was okay. The house looked the same as before. The lawn was still neatly trimmed, and the flower boxes were still there under the windows. But the flowers looked even more wilted now, like nobody had watered them in days. It was a small detail, but it stuck with David as he continued to his actual delivery. Later that week, David was assigned a route that took him through several different neighborhoods. One of his stops was at a medical supply company where he had to pick up some packages for delivery. While he was there, he overheard 2 employees talking about a delivery they had made earlier. That security camera order was huge, one of them said. The guy ordered enough equipment to monitor a whole house. Indoor cameras, motion sensors, the works. David's ears perked up. Security equipment. That reminded him of the heavy package he had delivered to Michael Chen's house. The return label had been from a security company, though he hadn't paid much attention to the details at the time. People are really paranoid these days, the other employee replied, though I guess you can't be too careful. As David loaded his packages and left the medical supply company, he couldn't help but think about that conversation. Why would someone need so many security cameras for their house? Most people just had 1 or 2 cameras by their front door or maybe in their backyard. What kind of situation would require monitoring an entire house? The next Tuesday, David's supervisor called him into the office before his shift started. David worried he might be in trouble for something, but it turned out to be good news. He was being assigned to a new route that covered more of the residential areas, including Oakwood Drive. You've been doing great work, David, his supervisor said. Customers have been giving you good reviews, and you haven't had any complaints or damaged packages. This new route has some of our regular customers who specifically request reliable drivers. David thanked his supervisor and headed out to load his truck. He was pleased about the promotion, but he also felt a knot in his stomach knowing he would be returning to the light blue house on Oakwood Drive. When he arrived at the house that Tuesday, David noticed something different right away. There was a car in the driveway that hadn't been there before. It was a black SUV with tinted windows. The license plate was partially covered by mud, making it hard to read. David grabbed the package from his truck. This one was smaller than the last delivery, but it was also from a security equipment company. As he walked up the front path, he noticed that new security cameras had been installed above the front door and at the corners of the house. They were pointed in multiple directions, covering not just the front yard but also the sides of the house. He rang the doorbell and waited. This time it took much longer for someone to answer. When the door finally opened, it was the same woman as before, but David immediately saw that something was very wrong. She had a black eye. It wasn't a fresh injury. The bruising had that yellowish color that meant it was maybe a week old. She had tried to cover it with makeup, but under the bright afternoon sun it was still visible. When she saw David looking at her face, she quickly turned her head slightly to the side. "Delivery?" David said quietly, his voice more gentle than usual. The woman nodded and reached for the electronic signature pad. As she did, David noticed that she was wearing long sleeves again, even though it was an even warmer day than the week before. The sleeves of her sweater were pulled down all the way to her wrists, but what really alarmed David was what he heard from inside the house. It was the sound of a child crying, not the normal crying of a frustrated toddler or a kid who had scraped their knee. This was different. It sounded scared and desperate. The woman's eyes immediately darted toward the sound, and David saw panic flash across her face. She quickly signed the pad and tried to hand it back to him, but her hands were shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Please," she whispered. So quietly David almost didn't hear her. "Just leave it and go." The desperation in her voice made David's heart race. This wasn't just nervousness or shyness. This woman was genuinely afraid. And now he knew there was a child in the house too. As the woman started to close the door, David caught a glimpse of the interior of the house. What he saw made his blood run cold. There were security cameras mounted on the walls inside the house. Not just one or two, but several that he could see from his position at the door. They were pointed toward the living room and what looked like a hallway leading to the bedrooms. But that wasn't the worst part. On one of the doors he could see down the hallway. There appeared to be a deadbolt lock. But it was installed backwards. Instead of keeping intruders out, it would keep someone inside the room from getting out. The door closed quickly, and David found himself standing alone on the front porch. His mind was racing. Everything he had just seen painted a picture that made him sick to his stomach. The security cameras weren't for protecting the house from burglars. They were for watching the people inside the house. And those locks weren't for keeping bad guys out. They were for keeping someone trapped inside. David walked slowly back to his truck, his legs feeling unsteady. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment, trying to process what he had just witnessed. The woman's black eye, her obvious fear, the sound of a frightened child, the cameras pointed inward, the locks on the bedroom doors, it all added up to something terrible. As he drove away from Oakwood Drive, David's hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. He had studied domestic violence in his social work classes. He knew the warning signs. He knew the statistics. But seeing it in person, especially when it involved a child, was completely different from reading about it in a textbook. David finished his route that day, but he was distracted during every delivery. He kept thinking about the woman and the child in that house. He imagined them sitting in those rooms with the cameras watching their every move, unable to leave because of the locks on the doors. The thought made him feel physically ill. That evening, David went home and immediately pulled out his social work textbooks. He read through the chapters on domestic violence and child abuse, looking for guidance on what to do when you suspected someone was in danger. The books talked about reporting procedures and legal requirements, but they also emphasized how important it was to be careful. False accusations could destroy lives, but failing to act when someone was really in danger could be even worse. David knew he was at a crossroads. He could pretend he hadn't seen anything and just focus on doing his job. It would be easier and safer for him personally. But he also knew that if he was right about what was happening in that house, a woman and child were depending on someone, anyone, to notice their situation and help them. The next morning, David woke up with his mind made up. He couldn't ignore what he had seen. The question now was what exactly he should do about it. David spent the entire weekend researching what to do. He looked up domestic violence hotlines, read articles about recognizing abuse, and even called his social work professor for advice without mentioning specific details. Everyone he spoke to gave him the same message. If you suspect someone is in danger, especially a child, you have a moral obligation to report it. But David was also worried about making a mistake. What if he was wrong? What if there was an innocent explanation for everything he had seen? He didn't want to destroy someone's life based on assumptions. At the same time, he couldn't get the image of that frightened woman and the sound of that crying child out of his head. On Monday morning, David made a decision. Before starting his delivery route, he stopped by the local police station. He didn't file a formal report, but he spoke with an officer about his concerns. The officer listened carefully and took some notes. "We can't do much without more concrete evidence," the officer explained. "But we'll keep this information on file. If you see anything else that concerns you, definitely come back and talk to us." David left the police station feeling frustrated. He understood that the police couldn't just barge into someone's house based on his suspicions. but it felt wrong to do nothing when he was so worried about the safety of the people in that house. That Tuesday, David was back on his regular route, which included Oakwood Drive. As he approached the light blue house, he noticed the black SUV was gone from the driveway. In its place was a small sedan that looked like it might belong to the woman. David had a package to deliver to a different house on the same street, so he decided to deliver that one first and then circle back to the Chen house. As he walked up to the neighbor's door, he casually mentioned to the elderly woman who answered that he delivered packages to the whole neighborhood. "Oh yes, we know most of our neighbors," the woman said cheerfully, "though we don't see much of the family in the blue house. The wife seems very quiet. We've tried to be friendly, but she never really talks to anyone." "Do they have children?" David asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, a little girl. We see her sometimes in the backyard, but she never plays with the other kids in the neighborhood. Her father is very protective, I suppose. He works from home most days." This information made David even more concerned. A child who wasn't allowed to play with other kids, a mother who didn't talk to neighbors, a father who was always home watching everything. It all fit the pattern of an abusive situation where the victims were isolated from potential help. When David arrived at the Chen house, he noticed something that made his heart sink. There were now cameras visible in what appeared to be every window on the ground floor of the house. Someone inside that house was under constant surveillance. He rang the doorbell and waited. It took a long time for anyone to answer, and when the door finally opened, David almost gasped. The woman looked even worse than before. She had lost weight, her face was pale and drawn, and there were dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't been sleeping. "I don't have any packages for you today," David said gently. "I just wanted to check if you received everything okay last week." The woman looked confused and frightened by this unexpected conversation. She glanced quickly over her shoulder into the house, then back at David. "Everything's fine," she said quickly. "Please, you should go." But as she started to close the door, David heard something that made him take a step forward. It was the sound of a man's voice from inside the house, and he sounded angry. David couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably threatening. The woman's face went completely white. She looked at David with an expression of pure terror, and for just a moment he thought she might be about to ask for help. But then the man's voice got louder and she quickly shut the door. David stood on the porch for a moment, his mind racing. He had just witnessed something that confirmed all his worst fears. The woman was clearly terrified of someone in that house, most likely her husband, and there was still a child somewhere inside. As he walked back to his truck, David made a decision that went against everything his company had taught him about staying out of customers' personal business. He couldn't just drive away and pretend this wasn't happening. Instead of leaving immediately, David parked his truck down the street and waited. He told himself he was just making sure everything was okay, but he knew he was really gathering evidence. After about 20 minutes, the black SUV pulled into the driveway. David watched as a large man got out of the vehicle and walked into the house. Almost immediately after the man entered, David heard raised voices coming from inside. He couldn't make out specific words, but it was clearly an argument. Then he heard something that made him grab his phone. The unmistakable sound of someone crying out in pain. David's hands were shaking as he dialed 911. When the operator answered, he tried to explain the situation as clearly as possible. "I'm a delivery driver, and I think there's domestic violence happening at a house on my route. I can hear someone being hurt right now." The operator asked for the address and told David to stay on the line. Within 10 minutes, 2 police cars arrived on Oakwood Drive. David watched from his truck as the officers approached the house. What happened next unfolded like something from a nigh. Tomorrow. When the police knocked on the door, there was no answer at first. The officers knocked again, louder this time, and identified themselves. Finally, the door opened and the same man David had seen getting out of the SUV appeared. Even from his position down the street, David could see that the man was trying to act calm and friendly with the police. He was gesturing and talking, probably trying to convince them that everything was fine. But the officers weren't buying it. After several minutes of conversation, David saw one of the officers step past the man into the house. A moment later, the other officer followed. The man tried to block their entry, but it was too late. David's phone rang. It was the 911 operator, asking if he could see what was happening. "The police are inside the house now," David reported. "The man tried to stop them from entering, but they went in anyway." "Good," the operator said. "An officer may want to speak with you since you were the one who called this in. Can you stay in the area for a few more minutes?" David agreed to wait. His heart was pounding as he watched the scene unfold. More police cars arrived and then an ambulance. David's worst fears were being confirmed right in front of his eyes. After what felt like an eternity, David saw the officers escort the woman and a small child out of the house. Even from a distance, he could see that both of them appeared to be injured. The little girl was clinging to her mother, and both of them looked terrified. The man was brought out in handcuffs. One of the police officers approached David's truck and asked him to give a statement about what he had observed over the past few weeks. As David recounted everything he had seen and heard, he realized how many small details had added up to paint a picture of a dangerous situation. "You did the right thing calling us," the officer said. "This could have gotten much worse if you hadn't spoken up." As David drove away from Oakwood Drive that afternoon, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the woman and child were finally safe, but sadness that they had been suffering for so long before anyone noticed. He thought about all the deliveries he had made to that house, all the times he could have spoken up sooner. But he also felt proud that when it really mattered, he had found the courage to act. Sometimes being a good person means taking risks and making difficult decisions. David had learned that lesson in the most dramatic way possible. The days following the arrest were some of the most difficult David had ever experienced. He found himself constantly thinking about what might have happened if he hadn't made that phone call. The police had told him that his timing was crucial. They arrived just as the situation inside the house was escalating to a dangerous level. David's supervisor at the delivery company called him into the office the next day. David was worried he might be in trouble for getting involved in a customer's personal situation, but it turned out the company was proud of his actions. "The police contacted us to let us know what happened," his supervisor explained. "They wanted us to know that one of our drivers had potentially saved lives by being observant and caring enough to report what he saw. That's exactly the kind of employee we want representing our company." Instead of being reprimanded, David was commended for his actions. The company even decided to use his experience as part of their training program, teaching other drivers about recognizing signs of domestic violence and knowing when to seek help. But David struggled with feelings of guilt about not acting sooner. He kept replaying all his previous visits to the house, wondering if he could have prevented some of the suffering by speaking up after his very first delivery. His social work professor helped him work through these feelings. "You can't save everyone and you can't change the past," the professor told him during office hours. "What matters is that when you recognize the situation for what it was, you found the courage to act. That's more than many people would have done." A few days later, a detective contacted David to let him know more about what they had discovered at the house. The man, Michael Chen, had been controlling and abusing his wife Lisa and their 6-year-old daughter Amy for over 2 years. The security cameras David had noticed were part of an elaborate system Michael had installed to monitor their every move. The cameras were connected to his phone, the detective explained. He could watch them from anywhere, even when he was at work. The locks on the bedroom doors were designed to trap them inside at night. They were essentially prisoners in their own home. The detective also told David that Lisa and Amy were now staying at a domestic violence shelter, where they were receiving counseling and support. They were both physically healing from their injuries and starting the long process of emotional recovery. "Your call came at exactly the right time," the detective said. "According to what the victims told us, the violence had been escalating recently. Michael had been talking about taking more drastic measures to ensure his family never left him. We may have prevented something much worse from happening." This information was both comforting and disturbing to David. He was glad he had acted when he did, but the thought of how close things had come to tragedy made him realize how important it is for people to trust their instincts when something doesn't seem right. A week later, David received an unexpected phone call. It was from a social worker at the domestic violence shelter, where Lisa and Amy were staying. She explained that Lisa had asked to speak with him if he was comfortable with that. "She wants to thank you personally," the social worker said. "She says she had given up hope that anyone would ever notice or care about what was happening to her and her daughter." David agreed to meet with Lisa at the shelter, though he was nervous about the encounter. He didn't know what to expect or what to say to someone who had been through such trauma. When he arrived at the shelter, David was surprised by how normal it looked from the outside. It was just a regular house in a quiet neighborhood, with no signs indicating what it was. The social worker explained that the location was kept secret for security reasons. Lisa was waiting for him in a small conference room. She looked much different than she had during his package deliveries. Her bruises had faded and she seemed calmer and more relaxed. But what struck David most was that she was smiling, something he had never seen her do before. "I wanted to thank you," Lisa said as soon as David sat down. "I know what you did wasn't easy and I know you didn't have to get involved. But you saved our lives." Lisa went on to explain how isolated and hopeless she had felt during the months of abuse. Michael had gradually cut her off from friends and family, convinced her that no one would believe her if she tried to get help, and made her feel like she was trapped with no way out. "I used to pray that someone would notice," she said. "When you kept coming to the house for deliveries, I wanted so badly to ask for help. But I was terrified of what Michael would do if he found out. Those cameras were recording everything. He watched the footage every day to make sure I wasn't talking to anyone." Amy, Lisa's daughter, was doing well according to the counselors at the shelter. She was attending a new school and making friends for the first time in years. Lisa said Amy had asked about the nice delivery man and wanted to draw him a picture to say thank you. "She remembers you being kind to me," Lisa explained. "That meant more to her than you probably realize. She had gotten used to seeing adults be mean to me and to her. Your kindness reminded her that not all grown-ups are scary." David was moved by this conversation, but he also felt humble. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He had just done what felt right in the moment. But Lisa helped him understand the impact his actions had on their lives. Before he left the shelter, Lisa told David about her plans for the future. She was working with counselors to rebuild her confidence and independence. She had also connected with other survivors of domestic violence and was considering becoming an advocate to help other women in similar situations. "I want to make sure other people know the warning signs," she said. "And I want them to know that there are people who care and who will help if you just ask." As David drove home from the shelter that day, he reflected on how much his life had changed in just a few weeks. He had started out as someone who just delivered packages and minded his own business. But now he understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do is pay attention to the people around you and care enough to act when something isn't right. His experience had also reinforced his decision to pursue social work as a career. He realized that helping people didn't always require a degree or a professional title. Sometimes it just required being observant, being caring, and being brave enough to speak up when you see someone in need. David also thought about all the other delivery drivers, mail carriers, repair technicians, and other service workers who regularly visit people's homes. They were in a unique position to notice signs of trouble that others might miss. He hoped that by sharing his story, he might encourage others to trust their instincts and take action when they suspected someone needed help. The criminal case against Michael Chen was moving forward, and David had been told he might need to testify at the trial. He was nervous about that prospect, but he knew it was important for Lisa and Amy to see justice done. He also hoped that Michael would be held accountable for his AC tie-ins and would get the help he needed to change his behavior. 6 months had passed since that life-changing Tuesday on Oakwood Drive. David's daily routine had returned to normal in many ways. He still woke up early, loaded his delivery truck, and drove his familiar routes around town. But everything felt different now. He found himself paying closer attention to the people he encountered, noticing details he might have overlooked before. The criminal trial had concluded the previous month. Michael Chen had been sentenced to 8 years in prison for domestic violence, kidnapping, and child endangerment. David had indeed been called to testify, and while it was nerve-wracking to speak in front of a courtroom full of strangers, he felt good about doing his part to ensure justice was served. During the trial, more disturbing details had emerged about the extent of Michael's control over his family. The prosecution had presented evidence showing that he had been monitoring Lisa and Amy's every movement for over 2 years. He had installed tracking devices on Lisa's phone and car, recorded all their conversations, and even controlled when they were allowed to eat and sleep. The judge had called Michael's behavior systematic psychological torture and praised David for his courage in reporting what he had observed. Without the vigilance and moral courage of Mr. David Williams, the judge had said, this case might have ended very differently. But for David, The real reward came in the form of periodic updates about Lisa and Amy's progress. The social worker at the shelter kept him informed about how they were doing, always with Lisa's permission. The news was consistently encouraging. Lisa had found a job working at a nonprofit organization that helped other domestic violence survivors. She had discovered a natural talent for connecting with women who were going through similar experiences. Her own journey from victim to survivor to advocate had given her unique insights into what people needed. During their healing process, she has become one of our most effective counselors, the social worker had told David during their most recent phone conversation. Survivors trust her because she's been where they are. She knows what it's like to feel hopeless and trapped, but she also knows that recovery is possible. Amy was thriving in her new environment. She was attending regular school for the first time in years and had made several close friends. The counselors reported that her nightmares had stopped and she was beginning to act like a normal, happy child again. She was taking swimming lessons and had joined a soccer team, activities that would have been impossible under her father's controlling surveillance. One afternoon, David received a surprise visitor at the delivery depot. It was Lisa, accompanied by the social worker from the shelter. She was holding a large envelope and smiling broadly. "I hope you don't mind us dropping by," Lisa said. "Amy made something for you and she really wanted to make sure you got it." Inside the envelope was a hand-drawn picture showing a delivery truck, a stick-figure man in a uniform, and two stick-figure females waving from the door of a house. At the bottom, in careful first-grade handwriting, Amy had written, "Thank you for helping me and my mommy. You're a hero." David felt his eyes fill with tears as he looked at the drawing. He had kept the news clipping from the local paper about the case, and his company had given him a commendation certificate. But this simple drawing from a 6-year-old girl meant more to him than any official recognition. "She talks about you sometimes," Lisa explained. "She remembers that you were always nice when you came to our house. In her mind, you're the person who helped us escape from the scary place. She wanted you to know that she's happy now and that she still thinks about how kind you were." Lisa also had news to share about her advocacy work. She had been invited to speak at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement officers, helping them learn to recognize signs of domestic violence. She was also working with delivery companies and other service organizations to train their employees about what to look out for and how to report concerns appropriately. "Your story has become an important part of our training program," she told David. "We use it to show people that ordinary citizens can make a huge difference just by paying attention and caring enough to." The ripple effects of David's decision to call the police that day had extended far beyond just saving Lisa and Amy. Their story had inspired changes in policy and training that would potentially help many other families in similar situations. David's own career path had also evolved. He was now in his final semester of social work school and had been accepted into a graduate program specializing in family services. His professors often used his experience as a case study in their classes, and he had been invited to speak to other students about the importance of community awareness in preventing domestic violence. The delivery company had promoted David to a supervisory role, partly because of his excellent work record, but also because of his demonstrated judgment and character. He was now responsible for training new drivers, and he always made sure to include information about recognizing signs of trouble and knowing when to seek help. "We're not just delivering packages," David would tell the new drivers during their orientation. "We're often the only outside people who regularly visit customers' homes. That puts us in a unique position to notice when something isn't right. We can't solve everyone's problems, but we can be the eyes and ears that help connect people with the resources they need." 1 year after the incident on Oakwood Drive, David received another surprise. It was a formal letter from the mayor's office informing him that he had been selected to receive the city's annual Good Samaritan Award. The ceremony would be held at City Hall, and both Lisa and Amy would be there to present the award to him. The night before the ceremony, David reflected on how much his life had changed. He thought about the scared young man he had been just 1 year earlier, worried about making the wrong decision and unsure whether he should get involved in someone else's problems. He had learned that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy choice, but it's still the right choice. At the award ceremony, David was humbled by the kind words spoken about his actions. The mayor called him an example of how ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to care about their neighbors. The police chief praised him for having the courage to trust his instincts and take action when it mattered most. But the most meaningful moment came when Amy, now 7 years old and confident in a way she had never been before, stepped up to the microphone to say a few words. Mr. David saw that me and my mommy needed help. And he helped us, she said in her clear, sweet voice. Now we're safe and happy. Thank you for being brave and kind. As David looked out at the audience that night, he saw other delivery drivers, postal workers, repair technicians, and service workers who had come to hear his story. He hoped that some of them would remember his experience if they ever found themselves in a similar situation. He hoped they would understand that they, too, had the power to change someone's life just by paying attention and caring enough to act. David's story had become more than just a personal experience. It had become a reminder that heroism doesn't always look like what we see in movies. Sometimes it looks like a delivery driver who notices something isn't right and decides to do something about it. Sometimes it looks like ordinary people choosing to be extraordinary when the situation calls for it. And sometimes it looks like a frightened woman and child who find the strength to rebuild their lives after someone shows them that there are still good people in the world who care about their safety and well-being.